All right, let's get started. So we've just finished up Revelation chapter 5. If you recall, many moons ago when we first started Revelation, we sort of mapped out what our path forward was. And at sort of periodic points, we would have these sort of parenthetical studies that are broadly related to eschatology and generally fit within where we were in the text of Revelation. So we are in another one of those right now. So we're basically going to be starting Revelation chapter 6, and that through 19 and then through 22 is essentially the rest of it, and is generally what people think of when they think of the book of Revelation. In order to do that, I wanted to do an introduction of sorts to that, because we nominally have sort of 13 chapters coming up about like the judgments and the actual progression of things during what I'll call the 70th week of Daniel. And that's a lot to go through. However, Matthew 24 is essentially a one-chapter summary of all of that. So I wanted to kind of orient us, establish the scope and the limits of what we're talking about, and sort of bound this time period that we're discussing, so we understand that we're not discussing things happening now or things that have happened in the past or things that will happen, necessarily prior to the rapture or something like this, but this is exclusively happening within a specific 7-year period that is yet future. So that's basically going to be our intent. With that said, let's pray in. Heavenly Father, I thank you for our time here together. I pray you open the scriptures to us, Lord, and that even in these passages that can oftentimes seem difficult or confusing and far and remote, I pray you'll open them to us, not simply so we can understand some little tidbit of prophecy, but so we can more fully understand you, your working in the world, and what you would specifically have for each one of us to do in light of that, Lord. Amen. All right, as always, main point, we're going to hit it up front so no one gets lost or confused. We're going to talk about the difference between Matthew 24 and Luke 21. Most commentators will sort of group those together and say that they're both sort of the Olivet Discourse. From the text itself, I think it's fairly easy to prove that that's not the case, and I would like to demonstrate that. Regardless of whether or not you hold that particular view, we are going to be stuck in Matthew 24 for the remainder of this. And this is essentially the outline that we're going to be using. So we're going to hit up the point and time of Matthew 24. If we understand what question Jesus is answering, who he is answering it to, then everything else kind of falls into place, and we'll sort of avoid a lot of the hyperbole and hysteria that oftentimes follows the study of prophecy. Then we're going to talk about the time of the signs. I do not say the signs of the times. I think that's sort of a misnomer. We're dealing with a time, and in that time there are signs associated with it, not the other way around. We're going to talk about the Great Tribulation, that particular period in that nomenclature. We're going to discuss the second coming. Then Jesus is going to start giving us basically some further refinement and the way that we're actually supposed to treat and take this passage. We're going to talk about the sort of the parable of the fig tree, or more specifically the fig tree, and how it relates to this generation and whatever that happens to be, because that'll be important for sort of the way you're supposed to view this. We're going to discuss the doctrine of imminence, and then finally our response to all of this. Again, we're sort of reaching into the part of the book of Revelation that I frankly don't think is about us, as we discussed at length in a 2-part series on the rapture. I think we are well out of here by the time this all starts taking place. So if that's the case, then what does this actually mean for us? What are we supposed to do with all of this if we're not, physically present there at the time this happens? And if you take away nothing else, that's kind of what you should take away. And then finally, I'm going to do a final breakdown of art. I know you love like pretty tables and stuff like that. I made another pretty table for you. Basically going through the comparisons between Matthew 24 and Revelation sort of 6 through 19 to finally demonstrate that this is, in fact, exactly what Jesus is talking about. We need to sort of keep that in mind whenever we talk about this passage. So the main point, again, examination of Matthew 24 in light of Revelation 6 through 19, to basically be an introduction and guide to that. What's going to happen is the disciples are going to go to Jesus. They're going to ask him a specific question. That question is basically, when is the end times and when are you coming back? It essentially is what they're getting at. He is going to be answering that question, and he is going to tell them the things that are specifically going to precede that specific event. He is not talking about things that happen prior to the rapture. He is talking about things that happen after the rapture. Our response to this, and I sort of tried to come up with a good, memorable way to summarize my thoughts on this, but I summarized it as the readiness to act, the diligence to duty, and the usefulness to our master. That's how we should be treating all of this. Number one, a readiness to act. Everyone needs to structure their lives in such a way that they are always ready to act when God calls them. When you really want to get down to it, in the parables that Jesus gives right after this in Matthew 25, that's basically what he's talking about. He's saying, be ready, always be ready and useful for anything that is going to happen to you. Next, be diligent. This is consistency in our devotion and commitment which transcends emotions and simply does the right thing because it's right. So a lot there, but I will point out, number one, it goes beyond emotion. It's not how we feel. It's not whether or not we want to do something. It's if that's what we've actually been called to do or not. Most of the times in my life, I don't want to do a lot of things, but I have to do them anyway. I usually don't want to go to work in the morning. I would rather do other things instead. But guess what? I got to do that anyway. And you know what? Hopefully I bring glory to God in so doing that by, if nothing else, being a really good and diligent employee that my boss can always rely on. And then finally, usefulness to our master. We have to follow whatever path God has given us and actually execute on the specific mission that he has given us. At the end of all of this, Jesus is basically going to say this in the inspired text himself. He's basically going to tell us that we have a duty to be ready and to be useful and to actually be diligent about whatever it is that he's given us. So even though, yes, we are not specifically going to be around at this time, I believe, and I think that's very attestable from the scriptures, we do have a lot of things that we were supposed to be doing prior to that. There is still a lot of work to be done. Again, I like to point out that if you go overseas and you talk to a lot of the churches that are over there, that are either persecuted or living in, largely sort of pagan kind of countries, they're not really sitting on a knife's edge waiting for Jesus to come back because they still see so many people that need to get saved and they still see so much work that is there to be done. For some reason, I don't want to say rapture mania is a phenomenon in sort of largely rich Western countries, but it sort of is. So, with that said, let's actually dive into the text. So, quick overview real quick. You can open to Matthew 24 or Luke 21. Either one will do. I've put them both up on the screen for us to go through. So, if you go to Matthew 24, the passage that most people point to that is sort of the key passage is starting in verse 7. It says, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows." And then there's a word called then. At that point, Jesus is going to talk about everything that takes place after all of these things have taken place. So we have some sort of statement, this beginning of sorrows, and then we have something that happens after that point. If we skip down here to Luke 21, we're going to see a similar set of circumstances, but a slightly different ending to it. It says, "Then he said unto them, Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines and pestilence, and fearful signs and great signs shall there be from heaven. But before all of these things, they shall lay your hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake." So we have these signs, this grouping of events, basically nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes, famines, and pestilence. Before all of these things take place, the rest of Luke 21 is going to happen. After all of these things, the rest of Matthew 24 is going to happen. We essentially have a statement that is demarcating a line in history, and there's going to be two things on either side of that. So figuring out what is on either side of that is given to us when you actually read the context of the question. Again, you can read this in the text yourself. So, who is Jesus actually speaking to? In Matthew 24, he's speaking to Peter, James, John, and Andrew. You can find that in Mark 13, verse 3. And this is a specific private briefing that Jesus is giving to them and not the other disciples. He makes that very clear. So that is who he's speaking to. The question that prompted it was about the destruction of the temple, but specifically what comes after that event. That is what he is talking about. Matthew 24 is given at the Mount of Olives and is rightly called the Olivet Discourse, or the discourse that happens at the Mount of Olives. In the book of Matthew, who is a Jew, who is overall writing to other Jews about their Messiah. That's basically the point of Matthew. He is a Levite. He is approaching things from a Levitical perspective. He is giving sort of a Levitical genealogy of Jesus at the very beginning. Luke is very different. This is given broadly to the disciples. Jesus starts by speaking of the destruction of the temple, but he is specifically addressing what is going to take place before the destruction of the temple. And again, that's in verses 6 and 7. There is no indication in the text that this takes place at the Mount of Olives. It could have possibly been given actually in the temple itself based on the text, and is a follow-up. Peter, James, John, and Andrew eventually ask this question about what comes after this, because at this point he's told them that the temple is going to be destroyed. If you're a Jew, your entire world has just fallen apart because literally all of your life revolves around the temple. And he just says the temple is going to be destroyed. Your first thought is, what happens after that point? Well, he tells them the things that are going to happen after that point. This happens in the book of Luke, who is a Gentile concerned basically about presenting that to a Gentile or Greek-speaking audience. That is what he's actually talking about. He focuses a lot on Jesus' parables and things that, you know, a Gentile mind would be a little more interested in, as opposed to sort of a Jewish genealogy and looking at things from sort of a Levitical or a law-based system. So that's the first thing I wanted to clear up. I have a nice, fun, pretty picture here for us to look at to make this a little more clear. So we've got our verses here with nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilence, earthquakes. You can see all of that broken out. Essentially, we've got Luke 21. Whatever is going on here is before all of these things. The best way to look at that is the initial desolation of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So what Jesus is talking about then is the Romans going to come up against them under Titus Vespasian with the 5th, 10th, 12th, and 15th Roman legions. And they're going to lay a siege trench around the whole thing. And he's going to tell them, hey guys, when you start to see all of those things happen, get out of Jerusalem. That's basically what his message is in Luke 21. After that point, we have the beginning of sorrows, which is all of this stuff that he laid out. And then after those sorrows, so then we're going to have the second desolation, or what we would think of as Daniel's 70th week prophecy, because that's what he's speaking of. And in fact, we'll see in Matthew 24, he tells you that that's what he's talking about, because he specifically references the prophet Daniel. And Daniel, when he was writing, really couldn't have been writing about the first destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, because his prophecy clearly goes beyond that point. Another way to map this out, by the way, I stole these graphics from the commentaries of Chuck Missler, because he actually organized this really well, so I copied it. So we've basically got this first desolation. We've got the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, dealing with that specific generation. We're in this period called the Church Age, with those 7 letters being written to 7 churches that we discussed for conveniently 7 weeks. Then we've got these wars, famine, earthquake, pestilence, etc. This is going to be sort of your immediate beginning and demarcation of the thing that we call the Great Tribulation, or more specifically, the 70th week of Daniel. In the Old Testament, oftentimes called the time of Jacob's troubles or the time of Jacob's travail, something along those lines. That is the last generation, and that's specifically what Jesus is going to be talking about with the fig tree. And then after that, everything is finally going to get wrapped up. So, to clarify one final time, Luke is dealing with what's going to happen in 70 AD and how the Jews are supposed to deal with it. Matthew 24 is dealing with what's going to happen basically during the tribulation period and what the Jews are supposed to do about that. We've got this beginning of sorrows, which is marked by this nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famine, pestilence, and earthquakes. And that is the beginning point of everything that's going to follow. And that's the first thing that we're going to see basically in that order when we get into Revelation chapter 6. Does it make sense? Everyone tracking what I'm saying? Cool. I will also point out Acts 17:11. Don't magically believe everything that I tell you, but follow what Jesus had told you and search the scriptures and prove if what I'm saying is true or not. So don't magically believe what I'm saying. Okay, now that we have sort of the scope and limits of what we're talking about, let's actually dive into the text. So let's go to Matthew 24. Verses 1 through 3. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, now again, this is a private briefing, and we'll be told specifically in Mark that was Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So this is a different group of people. At this point, chronologically, he's already done Luke 21. He's already answered their question about the temple. Now they're asking the follow-up question about, great, now what do we do? That's essentially what's going on. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So they want to know, when's that going to happen? He's more or less answered that, but he'll give them a little bit more. What is the sign of your coming? We're going to be dealing with the second coming, not the rapture. And then when's the end of the age? So that's what we're dealing with here. We need to, first of all, restate that there are no preconditions necessary for the rapture. That was made very clear in Revelation 1, verse 1, and will be made clear actually in Matthew 24 as we get on later into that. If the rapture happens before the tribulation, then looking for signs of the approaching tribulation doesn't really make sense. It may be interesting, it may be fun, it may be useful to sort of see God's working in the world, but if there's no signs for the rapture, then why are we looking for them? There's signs for a second coming, but not the rapture. So these things, we're going to be given a series of events in the next verses. So wars, famine, rumors of wars, cosmic upheavals, earthquakes, etc. Again, those are that's the boundary and the demarcation of what we're actually talking about. The sign of his coming. This is the second coming, not the rapture. Remember, at this point, that hasn't fully been revealed to them yet. And actually, even in Acts chapter 1, when Jesus is going back, they're still a little confused about all of this. In fact, even the idea that, where he goes, they will eventually go also. That's going to be told to them in sort of, I think it's John 15, which is after this point. So they're interested in sort of something different at this point. And then finally, the end of the age. What they're talking about is the ultimate establishment of the kingdom. That's what the Jews have been looking for really since the beginning, since it was promised to Abraham. They want to know, essentially, when is all of this going to be wrapped up? The millennial kingdom is basically going to be the establishment of that. What we saw with Jesus in chapter 5 taking possession of that scroll, that is not simply the title deed to the earth, that is also essentially the narrative mechanism, if you will, by which he is going to take control of everything. He opens up each of the seals, and we see another judgment, and another judgment, and another judgment, etc. That beginning of the reign starts off the establishment of the kingdom. There is sort of a strange satanic rebellion that happens in the middle after 1,000 years, and then after that point, everything is ultimately and finally wrapped up, and we get into the eternal state. I use that verbiage specifically because I want to distinguish between the millennial kingdom and the eternal state, because generally most people will broadly speak of heaven or something like that. That's a very broad term that unfortunately is often overused and doesn't actually limit the scope of what we're talking about. All right. Verses 4 through 14. So now Jesus is going to answer their questions, which are clearly eschatological. He says, "And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet, for nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by the nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." So we're talking about events that are going to take place in the tribulation. I know a lot of people will point to things like earthquakes, famines, pestilence, etc., as sort of a sign preceding all of those things. I understand why they say that, but that's not technically what it's talking about. It's talking about what happens when you get into that period. If earthquakes and famines and pestilence, etc., are a sign of the end times, then clearly as soon as Adam fell, we were living in the end times, because that's been happening since the beginning. So I have a hard time seeing that. The only way you can actually distinguish it is by looking at the totality and the severity of those things that are described, starting in Revelation chapter 6, because what's being spoken of there is far beyond what you would consider sort of natural phenomenon. So we have to keep this in mind. We're dealing with very specific eschatological end times events that are taking place here. Persecution of the Jews. This is an interesting one. Again, this is referring to a yet future persecution. During the Holocaust, about 1/3 of the Jews in Europe were killed. From that, the Jews have, taken the saying upon themselves, never again. According to Zechariah 14, not only is it going to be 1/3 next time, but it's going to be 2/3 of all Jews on the planet that are going to die. Yeah, that's kind of horrifying when you think about it. That's what Zechariah says. So there are still yet future persecutions that are going to have to happen. Note, interestingly, however, that this is for Christ's sake. I would have to imagine that if it's for Christ's sake, that the ones that he's talking about are the ones that are actually persecuted, which is actually kind of interesting if you think about it. Now, I don't know if that necessarily means all of these are martyrs in that capacity. We do know that a lot will live through this, either because they were sealed in Revelation chapter 7 or because they heeded Jesus' warnings and fled accordingly. That's something we'll get into in, I think, chapter 12. But clearly, there is going to be severe persecution taking place at this time. Again, the Jews have been persecuted largely for the last 2,000 years, and arguably even prior to that. However, I think it's hard to say that they've been persecuted for Jesus' sake. Maybe in the broadest sense of things, you can say that they were in that, all things are, going according to God's plan. But let's be real, they weren't really following Jesus, and the people that were persecuting them weren't really following Jesus. I don't think Jesus was really being glorified by any of the persecutions that were happening past, present, and potentially future. So clearly, if they're suffering for his name's sake, we're dealing with something of a fundamentally different nature and character. That's an interesting question. I do know that the 144,000 are specifically sealed away. I do know, and this is at the post-halfway point, that a lot are going to realize that the person they've been following is not the Messiah, and they will, flee because of that. this is one of those areas where there's a lot of places to speculate. I think we'll probably get into a lot of those speculations later. My goal right now is not so much to speculate, but simply to lay down what we know so we can have boundaries to act within what we don't know, if that makes sense. But yes, I do think that a lot of Jews are going to get saved during the tribulation. I think that's made very clear. I think it's also made very clear in the scripture that's essentially what's going on. If you read Hosea 5 and 6, that's basically God forcing them to such a position that they have to ask for Jesus to come back. That's basically what's going on there. But yeah, next we get the spiritual condition of that time, in the tribulation. He says something interesting. He says that love is going to grow cold. That word there for love is agape. Now, this is really interesting when you think about it. I think you can build a very good case from the scriptures that agape only comes from God. Now, yeah, so, God is love. God is agape. We agape him because he agaped us first. The fruits of the Spirit are agape, love, joy, peace, patience, etc., etc. We don't really see agape in that love context spoken of by Jesus by anyone who's unsaved, who's not following him. So if that's the case, if all of the Christians and all the people following God are out, then how can the agape of many grow cold? That's an interesting question to think about. Agape, and it's, I think, noun form, agapeo, means to be totally given over to something. You have made it your entire specific, singular, directing passion for everything that you do in your life. That's really what that word is getting at. If you have that growing cold and you have essentially nothing that you care about or hold dear or anything, we could be dealing with a time of basically total disillusionment with all value and all value systems and a total focus on self. Because you have nothing to give to anyone else. Even if you did, who cares? Because nothing matters and it's all totally valueless. Not even value relative, but valueless. Ironically, Nietzsche in his discussion of the last men is probably what this is in a philosophical sense referring to. Yeah, I think that would actually kind of make a little bit of sense that, yes, agape has been essentially removed from the world, but even the desire of people to have any sort of value or centering thing in their life or have any sort of passion would be gone. And you can kind of understand why that would make sense. Because everything is horrible, nothing is good, everyone is fundamentally evil, and they are now allowed to do all of the evil that they have ever wanted. There's complete, total destruction on both a local and a cosmic level. Why bother caring about anyone, anything, because it's literally just going to be destroyed tomorrow? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. I kind of wonder if that's what it's talking about. Because, again, it doesn't make sense to me that if agape only comes from God, how could the agape of many grow cold if that's already been removed in the first place? I could be wrong on that point. I haven't noticed anyone else point that out, but that's my personal thought on the matter. Finally, he says, the end is not yet. Again, that's really important because we have to note what we're dealing with. The end, in this case, is going to talk about his second coming. That's essentially what he's talking about. He's saying, hey, you've had all these crazy things happen. You've got earthquakes, famines, wars, pestilence, persecution, etc. The end is not yet. We are dealing with clear eschatological implications here. The primary literal meaning is directed to those people in the tribulation that are going through this, and they are going to be looking for the second coming of Jesus. If you are at this point saved, whatever knowledge you happen to have, you're waiting for Jesus to come back. And he's saying, hey, you're in the period. The end is not quite yet. Essentially what's going on there. Verses 15 through 28. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So again, this is linking us back to Daniel's 70th week prophecy. In the 70th week prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, we essentially have 4 verses that cover this period of time. In Matthew 24, we have 1 chapter deals with this period of time. In Revelation, we have like 13 chapters that deals with it. So each one is a progressive revelation and expansion on the same idea. spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Whoever reads, let him understand. So that's a parenthetical insertion there. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is in the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant in those days, who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Again, I'm going to point out, he's talking to Jews in this. Does a Gentile care when the Sabbath is? He's talking to people in Judea. Does the average Gentile care about Judea? Nope. So he's talking to Jews in Judea at this time. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. I'm going to point out again this phrase, the elect. We usually think of, us, Christians in the modern age as the elect. That is true and that's correct. God's had elect before us and he's had elect after us. He speaks of the elect numerous times in the Old Testament. He's going to speak of them numerous times after the time of the church has gone. So don't let that phrase sort of hang you up somehow. God has only ever had one way of saving people, past, present, or future, and that's by grace through faith. So, verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So it's apparently not going to be possible to deceive those people at this time that are truly his, but if it was possible, even they would be deceived by the quality of the deception that's given out. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes from the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. In other words, it's going to be really fast. You're not going to outrun light. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. All right, so we have essentially a couple things being spoken of here. We have the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. We've got a warning to flee after that period. And then we have warnings against false messiahs. So the abomination of desolation. More literally, what that reads is the abomination which makes desolate. That's literally what it's saying. So abomination is an idol in this context. Typologically, in Daniel, if you bother to read through that entire 70th week prophecy, there's basically two aspects of it. There's a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. Those of you that are familiar with the Levitical system and prophecy, you'll probably be familiar with this. But God laid out for himself a 100% perfect standard. A prophet had to be right 100% of the time, or he was not a true prophet of God. Now, we have an immediate problem when we start to think about that. If you are a prophet of God, and God gives you a prophecy for something that's not going to happen for 1,000 years, how does anyone know if you're a legitimate prophet or not? Well, God thought of that edge case, and he said, all right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you a prophecy. There's going to be one fulfillment of that that's going to happen in the near sense, and there's going to be a far fulfillment of that that's going to happen later. Therefore, when you see the thing that's going to happen, in a couple years or whatever, you'll know that this is a legit prophet. Because you know that this is a legit prophet, you know that the thing he's talking about in 1,000 years from now is actually going to happen. Isaiah chapter 9 is probably the most famous example of it, where Isaiah gives the prophecy of the virgin birth. A woman, a virgin, will conceive and bear a son, etc., etc. We, put that on a lot of Christmas cards. What people miss is the actual context of what's being spoken of there, because Isaiah, or God through Isaiah, I guess, is giving a prophecy to King Ahaz about basically the coming war that's going to happen and the ultimate victory that Israel is going to have in that. That was the immediate near fulfillment, but there was clearly a larger fulfillment that happens after that point. So we know from that near fulfillment and that far fulfillment that Isaiah was a real prophet. Does that make sense? Did I lose anybody? Okay, cool. In Daniel's 70th week prophecy, we basically have sort of the same kind of thing. We see an initial abomination of desolation spoken of that is typologically similar to what we're going to see in the end times. We have a guy named Antiochus IV, sometimes called Antiochus Epiphanes, I'll just call him Antiochus IV, who was a ruler of the Seleucid dynasty after basically the death of Alexander the Great. He comes into basically Israel, or the Holy Land, and decides that he's going to wipe out the local Jewish religion, wipe out their temple, their religion, their ceremonies. He made the reading of the Torah illegal and I believe punishable by death. He desecrated the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar, etc., etc., etc. So he comes through and does all of that up to and including basically raising an idol to Zeus in the Holy of Holies. Abomination of desolation is basically what we're talking about. Interestingly enough, if you go through his entire life and his acts and his military campaigns, I believe that his entire life foreshadows what we will see happen in the end times far more closely than I think we have necessarily thought of. Because after he goes and does all of that, he goes down to Egypt to basically form an alliance, put down rebellions, etc., things like that. And then he gets called back to up north to modern day Israel because he's received tidings of some sort of war that's going to come in on his flank or whatever. As he's going up and doing that, a rumor starts to spread that he's dead. And a lot of people start thinking he's dead for whatever reason. He died in battle or whatever. That eventually gets put down and he is brought back and he is still alive and they continue on their campaigns. I would highly recommend you study Antiochus IV, and because I think the more I study his life, the more I look at the things that are spoken of in Revelation, and the more that I see spoken of in the final chapters of Daniel, I think that the typological patterns and similarities between those two people and two events is far more unique and specific than we've fully tracked down yet. Regardless, in the Great Tribulation, this is basically going to mark the middle of that time period. There are some people that hold that prior to the abomination of desolation that everything is more or less going to be kind of peaceful on the earth. I'll kind of put that in quotes. And that after that is when we start to see Revelation chapter 6 break forth. As we're going to see going through Revelation, that's really not the case. Basically, as soon as it starts happening, it starts happening. Furthermore, even just a basic chronological reading of the way Jesus has structured this passage would seem to indicate otherwise, because we've had famines, wars, pestilence, etc., that by their very nature must be more extreme and severe than anything previously seen or recorded. Otherwise, they wouldn't be very good signs. Next, what are the Jews supposed to do after this point? For whatever reason, they've had a guy go in, set up an idol in their rebuilt temple, and he's about to go crazy. He warns them to flee. Again, this is very clearly directed at Jews. It is speaking to people in Judea. It is speaking of the Sabbath. Jesus, at this point, is literally speaking to a Jewish audience, asking him Jewish questions about their Jewish Messiah and their Jewish temple. And now he's telling them to worry about Jewish things like the Sabbath. So that's who is being addressed here. And then warnings of false messiahs. This is really interesting when you think about it. Throughout the history of Judaism, since basically Christ came, died, rose again, and went up to heaven, the Jews have really struggled with a lot of false messiahs. The first one that I was really able to track down happened, I think, actually a couple decades after Jesus' ascension. But the main one that most people focus on is the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, who he was declared to be the Messiah. And if you go through Jewish history, you'll find countless lists of false messiahs that have presented themselves, and at least a section or subset of Jews have believed were the Messiah. This passage, again, is not talking about any of those per se. I think it's a continuation of a pattern that they've seen up until that present time. Again, we are specifically dealing with the tribulation. We are specifically dealing with this point, And he's saying that false messiahs and false prophets are going to rise up. Very clearly, we can see that in what most people colloquially think of as the Antichrist, or the first and the second beast outlined in Revelation 13. However, it seems like just a basic cursory reading of this, it seems to suggest that there's going to be more of them than just that. I don't know fully how that's going to work out, but I have to imagine that at this point, people are going to be so desperate, they're going to be looking for anyone or anything that might promise them some form of relief. Jesus is basically saying, don't be deceived by any of those people. You're going to have all of these people coming around saying, I am Jesus, or Jesus is over there. Don't believe them, because I'm not there. I am in heaven, and I'm going to come back down. So if someone says, follow me, and I'm going to show you Jesus, you don't follow them because I'm not going to be there. That's what he's dealing with, and that's the specific problem that Jesus is preemptively attempting to address. He's saying, hey guys, I'm not down there yet. The end has not come. The end being his second coming and the establishment of the kingdom. I cannot be in the desert. I cannot be in a room somewhere because I'm in heaven, and I'm going to come back, it says, literally in a flash. It says, for as the lightning comes from the east and flashes from the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now we're going to deal with the second coming. So verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels to the great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So now we're actually going to deal with the second coming. Jesus has talked about all of the things that are going to happen prior. You've got, famines, wars, pestilence, etc., etc. You've got the Great Tribulation in total. You've got the abomination of desolation. You have the warning to the Jews to flee. And you have all of these false messiahs coming up, and he's saying, don't be deceived. I'm not coming back yet. Next verse. Okay, guys, now I'm coming back, and you're going to know, because everybody is going to see. No one is going to be confused. It's not going to be a secret, hidden sort of event. Now we see the sun, moon, stars, and heavens are going to experience calamity. There is some question and debate as to whether or not these are a singular event that happens, or whether or not this is another separate event. We're going to see several events like this happen in Revelation. We're going to see a series that are going to happen in Revelation chapter 6. Later, we're going to see another series that happens in Revelation chapter 8. And it appears that there's going to be another series that happens in the very end, right preceding his second coming, with the final set of judgments that come. My personal belief is that all of this stuff is basically laid out in a chronological order, because laying it out in any other order really doesn't make any sense, and they're all basically laid out in the same way. I have to imagine that he's laid that out chronologically for a reason. Again, getting back to our narrative mechanism of the scroll, you're opening it up and you're reading it one after the other. You're not skipping around in the page order, basically. So I believe that this is chronological. It would also make sense that each one of the times we see these sort of cosmic disturbances, it's basically upping the ante on everything that has happened previously. Because the final earthquake that we see in, I think it's Revelation 15, it says that there was nothing else like it before. So even all of these other earthquakes, etc., that we've seen so far, they are far worse and more impactful than anything that we have experienced in our life and history. And yet the one that's going to happen at the very end, so this end period, is going to be more severe than any of those other previous ones. So today a bad earthquake would be like a 7 on the Richter scale. Maybe the ones at the beginning are like a 9 on the Richter scale, and the final one is like a 12 or something like that. By the way, that's like starting to break the earth apart kind of earthquake. Now, the second coming is not the same as the rapture. Again, I want to point this out because that is what we're dealing with. We are dealing with what is going to happen prior to the second coming. So I've made a sort of a table here of sort of the rapture and the second coming and comparing a lot of the differences between them. So in the rapture, basically only those that are taken up see Jesus. I think we can fairly well establish that. However, during the second coming, everyone is going to see him. No one is going to be confused by that, and you see that in verse 30. It is going to be preceded by, let's go to 1 Thessalonians. I went the wrong way. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16 says, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord." It's going to be preceded by a loud voice. Interestingly enough, the second coming is preceded by Jesus coming back with a whole bunch of other people, or more specifically, he's coming back with a lot of other people. Other people are not mentioned in the rapture. Jesus is just kind of coming back. He may have, an angel or two with him for whatever reason, but he's not coming back with hosts or thousands upon thousands of his saints, as we're told in Jude 1, verse 14. So we already have another distinction there. Next, he doesn't land during the rapture. During the rapture, we just meet him in the clouds. He's not actually touching down. He's not even doing a touch and go. He's just going. In the second coming, if we go to, Zechariah 14, verse 14, he's going to touch down on the Mount of Olives. It says, "And in that day," remember that day is a technical prophetic term talking about the day of the Lord, or everything post-rapture out to the eternal state. "And in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem to the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south." So that's what's actually going to happen when Jesus finally touches down, is he's going to do it on the Mount of Olives. Next, the time. We've discussed this previously. I will refer you to our previous teachings on the rapture, but rapture happens before the tribulation. Second coming happens after the tribulation. I'm not going to beat that dead horse right now. What's it going to be followed by? After the rapture happens, we have the tribulation. Well, what happens after the second coming? Well, in Matthew 25, we see Jesus judging the nations. That's what happens. We don't see Jesus judging the nations after the rapture. There's other things that have to happen before that. What happens with Satan? Well, we're told that he goes roaming about because he knows that his time is short, and he's got his two guys down here doing their thing. So he's clearly very active in this time frame. However, after the second coming, Satan gets bound for 1,000 years. That's in Revelation 20, verses 1 through 3. He's bound for 1,000 years. Again, another difference between these two events. Why does the rapture happen? Is Jesus coming back for his church? Because he wants us to always be with him. That's kind of the whole point. However, the second coming is basically judging the nations and establishing the kingdom. That's why that's happening. So these are two very different events, and I want to point that out because even among very good, people who take prophecy seriously, there is usually a conflation that happens at some point between the rapture and the second coming, and people will cite verses for one versus the other, and it sort of really muddles the issue. So I'm trying to, again, very clearly mark what we're talking about. So at this point in the narrative, Jesus has told them a whole bunch of stuff is going to happen. You're going to see the abomination of desolation, flee to the mountains. Don't be confused if someone says that Jesus is here, there, or over there, because I'm not. At that point, I'm eventually going to come back. A whole bunch of other stuff is going to happen. I'm going to judge the nations and establish the kingdom. But now, he's going to tell us this, starting in verse 32. "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things," in other words, everything that I have just said, "when you see these things, know that it is near, at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Again, let's keep in mind what Jesus is doing. He's answering a Jewish question by a bunch of Jews asking about events that are going to affect them during the tribulation period. That is what is being dealt with here. Most people, probably 90%, when they start getting into this verse, they will start trying to equate this generation or the fig tree to the establishment of Israel in like 1948 or some variation thereof. That has nothing to do with what Jesus is talking about. I'm sorry, it just doesn't. We haven't seen the abomination of desolation yet. We haven't seen these sort of cosmic upheavals and disturbances. They haven't been told to flee into the mountains yet. It's not talking about that. We're talking about a totally different time period and a totally different, frankly, set of rules under which everyone is going to be operating because a lot of different things are going to be happening. Send it. Yes, he is saying, he is not saying, basically what this usually equates to is people will say, cool, Israel was established in the land. All right, now we have to figure out what a generation is. Some will say it's 40 years, some will say it's 70 years, some will say it's 120 years. Kind of doesn't matter because they all end up with something that's a little erroneous. Because if it's 40 years, that clearly hasn't happened yet, so you have to come up with some reason why it didn't happen after 40 years, and you just sort of get into date setting at that point. No, he is speaking specifically to that generation of people that find themselves going through all of that stuff, and he's like, hey, you people that are going through this, like, look at your watch, it's like 7 years, you're going to be the ones that are going to be going through all of this, and some of them at least making it through to the other side. It's not going to be a thing that goes on for like 5,000 years or something like that. You're the last ones. That's what he's talking about. Does that make sense? Okay, good. And again, don't believe everything that I tell you. I could be wrong. Search the scriptures for yourself and find out if it's true. Furthermore, one of the problems that I have with that sort of method that tries to link this either to the establishment of Israel or some current or historic event in Israel or Jewish history is that it fundamentally denies the doctrine of eminence. We are told multiple times in the scripture that no one knows the day or the hour. No one knows when Jesus is coming back. We are told in the original Greek of Revelation 1 verse 1 that there are no more preconditions necessary for Jesus to come back. If there's no further preconditions for him to come back, then us trying to line this up with anything that happens prior to that fundamentally denies that reality. If we're looking for some sort of generation within that time frame, we're essentially saying that that thing has to happen before Jesus can come back. And he said that that wasn't the case. So again, the point is this. You have a fig tree. When you see that fig tree change, you know that summer's coming. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. No one's confused about that. So those people in the tribulation, when they metaphorically see that fig tree change, in other words, all of those signs that he was talking about happen, they know that summer is near, i.e., this is the tribulation, and Jesus is about to come back. That's what he's talking about. He's told them all of the things that are going to happen. He said, this is the time frame it's going to happen. This is nominally how long it's going to be. You people in it are, in fact, the ones that are in it. And ultimately, at least in some sense, I have to imagine that would give them at least a little bit of hope, because hope, I think, is going to be in very short supply in these days, and it's going to be extremely hard and difficult. And knowing that, yes, this is, in fact, the last battle, for lack of a better way of putting it, you know, that can make it easier on you. If you know that, hey, this is a finite amount of time that we have to get through, that's one thing. If he said, nope, you're not the last generation, you still have 15 more generations of going through this, what's the point at that point? So he's telling them to be watchful, and he's telling them that it's almost done. Art, did you have something?
This may be a reach, but chapter 11, Jesus, I think the only natural thing, the only living thing that he ever cursed was a fig tree.
Yeah.
And he was talking about that as being representative of Israel.
Yep.
And now he's using this fig tree. I'm wondering if there's sort of a connection or continuity to the metaphor.
I would say, who's he talking to here? He's talking to a bunch of Jews answering Jewish questions. So yes, I do think that.
It was Matthew. Well, it was Mark too.
Yeah, it was. I do think that there is some continuity there in terms of the language that's used. But I would also say that the point that he was making there is this fig tree is representative of Israel in a national sense. Israel in a national sense has now rejected Jesus. Therefore, Israel in a national sense is cursed. That's what that passage is dealing with.
Could that fig tree up here still be Israel?
I understand why you're saying that. I'm going to go out on a limb and say no, because any time that Scripture interprets itself for us, I'm very wary to try and find a different explanation. Now, I think there is some validity in recognizing that the fig tree was representative of Israel, or more broadly the Jews, and he is speaking to them, and they are going to be going through that period of time. So I think that is valid, but I don't think in its any immediate, literal, primary meaning that's what it's talking about. Does that answer the question? Okay. So again, these are things we can bandy about, but I try to stay in the most immediate, literal sense of things whenever possible. Verse 36. But of the day and the hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then, excuse me. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at the hour you do not expect. Okay. The point of all of this is no one knows when he's coming back. Or, technically speaking, at the point of the midpoint with the abomination of desolation, you can actually calculate out exactly when he's going to come back. So he's kind of dealing with something else at this point. Essentially, he's saying no one knows when he's going to come back. We do know that the tribulation period is a very specific 7-year period. We do know that there is an error-correcting event that happens in the middle of that to make sure no one is confused, called the abomination of desolation. From there, per Daniel, you can calculate out exactly how many days it's going to be until he comes back. But the point that he's basically making here is, for specifically the rapture, we acknowledge that no one knows when he's going to come back for us, and that can happen at any time he chooses, then we need to be ready to accomplish whatever he's going to do. We need to constantly be watching. We need to constantly be useful for him, essentially. Again, his point is that we are waiting for him. If we had known when all this was going to happen, we would have prepared. Stay prepared. And it's essentially what he's saying. Now, we have this phrase in here, the days of Noah. This is something that trips up a lot of people, and they'll immediately get into sort of comparing and contrasting, what was happening in Genesis sort of 6, 7, and 8 with what we see here. I think there's probably some validity to that, and there is some merit, especially if you read Daniel chapter 2, which we'll probably do at some point. But that's not really a specific point that's being made. The point that's being made is you don't know when this is all going to be over. You don't know when the party's going to end. He says, first of all, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, but my Father only, talks about the days of Noah, and then finishes it off saying, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Basically, he's saying, he's using that time period and that cataclysmic destruction to say they didn't know when it was going to come. They weren't ready. They went into judgment because of that. Don't be like those people that were in the days of Noah. Be like Noah. That's essentially what he's saying. He continues on with this theme and talks about one being taken and one being left. Most see this as the one that is taken as the one who gets raptured, for lack of a better term. I think that's probably valid, and I think that's the one that best aligns. There is a minority view that sees it the other way around, that the one that is taken is the one that's sort of taken into judgment, and the one that's left is the one that gets to sort of inherit and go on from there. That is a minority view. I don't happen to hold it. It is something I occasionally see. I am very wary to kind of go down that path because, number one, it seems to directly contradict what we're told in 1 Thessalonians 4, where we are taken, not we are sort of left somehow. And second of all, because as I've gone through a lot of, I do a lot of reading, as I've gone through a lot of like New Age or occultic literature and the things that they actually teach in their own eschatologies, they refer basically to the Christians as the ones that are going to get taken, the big bad evil Christians, and all of the good people actually get left behind. That's a thing you'll come across when you read through a lot of New Age literature. So anytime that I see Christians sort of conforming themselves to what is actually being taught by Satan, I get extremely wary of whatever they're teaching, even if it seems like they can line it up correctly. Quick side note on this. In a strange way, this passage proves that the earth is round. Because all of this is going to happen at the same time. That's very clear. All of this is going to happen in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye. And yet you have men going out into the field together, which is sort of an activity you would do during the day. And you have women grinding at a mill, which is something they would do before the day, before the morning even, before the sun would rise. The only way you can have both of those activities happen at the same time is if the earth is round and you have different time zones where everything's happening. I think that's really interesting, and I leave it to you to track down more of that, but I came across it and I thought that was actually really, really cool. So Jesus repeats at the end that we're not going to know when the rapture is going to happen. That's to underscore the whole point of what's going on. I love studying prophecy as much as the next person, actually probably more than the average person. But I try not to get overly wrapped up in it. I try to remember what my function here is. My function is to serve God, not to get totally wrapped up in everything that I see happening around me. More specifically, I do wholeheartedly believe that God has called me to teach. Nothing more, nothing less, and I'm not going to go outside of those bounds. Therefore, I should put my effort towards doing those things and not other things, even if I may find them, fun or interesting at the moment. To wrap up, verse 45. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Basically, getting back to what we were talking about. Don't be like the people in the days of Noah who were eating and drinking and just not really doing anything, not caring about the judgment that was coming. No. Be ready, be doing the things that God's told you to do. Assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of the servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at that hour that he is not aware of, and he will cut him in two and appoint his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. In essence, be ready, be productive. We don't know when Jesus is coming back, so figure out what mission God has given us and take it out accordingly. It is very easy to make assumptions with prophecy, and it's very easy to find reasons to read into everything that we see around us and sort of assume that everything has to be fulfilled right now, absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts. Unfortunately, history is truly littered with people who took the Bible and took prophecy extremely seriously and made a complete mess of their lives because they assumed that they were about to do something that would fulfill prophecy. I will give a single example of this. The book that I'm pulling this from is Peter H. Wilson's The 30 Years' War. Fantastic. It's almost impossible to read. It's very difficult unless you have like a background in history and that kind of stuff. But it is really, really good. So if you like history, it's good. In that, I was really surprised reading through it how seriously those people, especially the Calvinists, took the Bible and took Bible prophecy. And they were looking around at the war and the things that they were going through, and they assumed that they had to be going through the tribulation, and assumed that they were about to bring in the millennial kingdom. And when you look at what was happening to them, it kind of makes a little bit of sense. In 1618, they saw a comet, a very famous comet. They saw signs and wonders in the heavens, just as they were told to look for. They saw plagues breaking out all around them, killing millions of people. They equated the Habsburgs with the kings of the south, as mentioned in, I think it's Daniel 11 and 12. And they saw them as a Catholic series of overlords ruling the world, in effect, under the Habsburg dominions, both in Europe and in the New World. And they saw that as sort of a worldwide universal Catholic persecution against, the good actual Lutheran/Calvinist Christians. And they saw, yes, he has to be the Antichrist right now. They saw rampant hyperinflation, and we'll see that when we start getting into Revelation chapter 6, specifically the time of Kippur und Viper in 1621. They saw wars and rumors of wars. There was actual, complete, total chaos and breakdown of all order. Banditry and brigandage was the order of the day. And there was, in many cases, very little distinction between a thief and a military commander. In fact, the way military commanders financed their campaigns is they would basically roll up to a city and extort it for everything that it was worth. They would go, nice town you've got there. Be a shame if something were to happen to it. You should probably give me all your money. And if they didn't get all of the money, they would rampage and go crazy. About 22% of the population would die because of all of that. It was a truly horrific war. You can understand why they thought they were living through the end times. You can genuinely understand that if you were at that time, and yet they didn't, in my mind, successfully demarcate the similarities and differences between what they were going through and what was spoken of by Jesus. Because yes, there were a lot of similarities, but there were also a lot of differences that they never took into account. And because of that, they made, frankly, a mess of their lives. They led millions of people to their death and, frankly, launched a lot of pretty horrific wars and slaughters because they thought they were acting out prophecy. They thought that by rebelling, they were going to bring in the millennial kingdom. It's easy for us to make inferences. One of the reasons why I've tried to stay so autistically literal to the text is to make sure we don't make similar mistakes. Because I want us to be fruitful. I don't want us to get distracted with everything that's going on, because that's very easy to do. Yes, we should look around us and understand what's going on, but we should understand what's going on not so much because we're trying to figure out exactly when Jesus is going to come back. He's already told us that that's not going to happen. We should know what's going on around us so we can know how best to fulfill the mission that God has given us. We need to be busy about the Master's work. That is why we are here. We're not here to get wrapped up in looking for signs. We're here to do a job. Now, I want to end on this, but I wanted to basically show the parallels between this passage that we just went through and basically the rest of Revelation. It's not perfect, but you will essentially notice that these are taking place in chronological order. I tried to organize it chronologically. It's a little off, but it's basically following the same patterns. We've got the abomination of desolation spoken of in both. We have false messiahs spoken of in both. In fact, that's what we're going to talk about next week. We've got wars, famine, earthquakes. We have martyrdom spoken of both. We talked about that with them being delivered up and persecuted. We're going to see that at least in two places, specifically in chapters 6 and 7. You could also argue with the two witnesses as well. We're going to see false prophets specifically called out. We're going to see the Jews told to take flight. We'll see that in chapter 12. We're going to see the preaching of the gospel. This is a really interesting one. The gospel is preached throughout the book of Revelation. We see it in chapter 7 with the 144,000 that are sealed. We're going to see it in chapter 11 with the two witnesses, and very specifically in chapter 14 with an angel in heaven that goes throughout the heavens with the eternal gospel. The gospel's still preached. We're going to see satanic miracles. It says signs and wonders, both in this passage and in Revelation 13. Signs and wonders. Jesus is talking about that, and the term that he uses for signs and wonders is the same word that he used for the signs and wonders of legitimate miracles. A lot of people will kind of take issue with the idea that Satan can perform miracles because they see that as only the realm of God. I think there's probably some validity to that. However, we have to understand that Satan ultimately is still under the authority of God. He can't do anything unless God allows him to do that. It wouldn't surprise me if God says, yeah, you can work that miracle if you want. There's another way to look at it. There's something called the simulacrum, which in either philosophy or computer science is a simulation of something that is so perfect it is indistinguishable from the real thing. And it wouldn't surprise me if, as part of that, he doesn't have the ability to so perfectly replicate a miracle that there is no functional distinction between the imitation of the thing and the real thing itself. But I do want to alert you to the point that it says that he will come with lying signs and wonders that are so good that if it was possible, even the elect, even the people that are following Jesus would be deceived by it. That's how good it is. We see a new heaven and a new earth spoken of. We'll see that the final two chapters of Revelation. We see cosmic disturbances all throughout Revelation. We see the second coming eventually in Revelation 19. And then finally, our orders to all of this. Let's end this by going to Revelation chapter 22. Revelation 22, verse 14. Blessed are those who do his commandments, not read them, not give intellectual assent to them, not think they're fun, not, post them as a sticky note on their computers. Do them, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates of the city. We all have a mission. It's different for everyone. God's called us for some unique purpose and task that he wants us to accomplish. It's our job to figure out what that is. And, our story as a Christian doesn't end when we get saved. It doesn't end when we go down the sawdust trail with tears in our eyes and we accept Jesus to be our personal Lord and Savior. That's just the beginning of it. It's what we do after that that really matters and really counts. With that said, let's pray out. Heavenly Father, I thank you for our time here. I thank you for your word. I pray that we would be diligent stewards of whatever you've given to us, Lord. That you will show us that unique ministry that you have for all of us, Lord. That through it all, through all the evil that we see in the world, we would not become discouraged. But that we would look to you and only to you, Lord. I pray that we would be useful for whatever it is that you've called us to. That we would lay aside the weights that encumber us. that prevent us from more fully giving ourselves to you and the mission that you've given to us, Lord. And I pray, Lord, if there's anything that I said here that was displeasing to you or that was totally off base, I pray that we'll just forget it and it will have no impact on us, and that only those things that are aligned to you and your word and your will impact us and take us out from here today, Lord. Amen. All right, next week, we're going to talk about the first seal, and that's all we're going to talk about. So I'll see you then.